Carney government is now focused on salvaging negotiations with an agreement solely to prevent sweeping new American border levies as of next week. Do you remember when Mark Carney said that we're not interested in interim agreements, we're only interested in comprehensive agreements? Yeah, I remember him saying that too. Canada-US trade talks appear to be in serious trouble, with multiple reports saying the two sides are nowhere near a deal, just days before the next round of punishing tariffs is set to hit. Now, Ottawa is reportedly scrambling for an interim agreement simply to stop those tariffs, while Washington is warning Canada not to retaliate. And where is Mark Carney? Nobody knows. Let's take a look. So, ladies and gentlemen, from the National Post, Canada and the US are, quote-unquote, not even close to a deal in trade talks, sources say. Ottawa. Canada and the US are, quote-unquote, not even close to a deal to alleviate existing tariffs, and the Carney government is now focused on salvaging negotiations with an agreement solely to prevent sweeping new American border levies as of next week. Do you remember when Mark Carney said that we're not interested in interim agreements, we're only interested in comprehensive agreements? Yeah, I remember him saying that too. 3 senior federal or provincial government sources told National Post that despite frequent meetings between the Canadian and American negotiating teams and the Damocles sword of new sweeping U.S. tariffs in days, both teams are, quote-unquote, very far apart on a deal. Now, the sources say, the Canadian side is refocusing its efforts to find an quote-unquote interim deal to prevent sweeping new tariffs on August 19th. Gee, it's almost like Mr. Carney is unable to handle Donald Trump. How could he handle him? He's in Italy sipping down some sort of vacation drink. If that's not possible, the Carney government is considering ways to financially support industries most harshly impacted by the new targeted tariffs. I get it. Donald Trump is a nightmare to deal with from the negotiating table. But I'm not the one who made the claim during the election that he could handle Donald Trump, that he knew how Donald Trump could negotiate, and that he would get a deal. And he would get a deal by July of last year. This is where we are. But their fallback position is the fallback position of every Liberal government that we've had in every year of this Liberal government back to 2015. When in doubt, throw more money at it. This is where we're at. I can't get my job done, so here's some more taxpayer money. To date, the negotiations for the federal government have, I'm going to insert been, largely two-pronged. Alleviate Section 232 tariffs on Canadian autos, which we've covered extensively on Northern Perspective. So that's Canadian autos, lumber, steel, and aluminum that range from 10% to 50% and prevent nearly $30 billion worth of new tariffs on a wide range of Canadian goods on August 19th. But 2 sources who were granted anonymity to discuss details of the private negotiations publicly said the Canadian team is now focusing on preventing the imminent tariffs. One source said the Americans made it clear that this time there would be no delaying their entry into force beyond the 19th. One industry source said a relief package for industries impacted by Section 338 tariffs is in progress, and the government is also considering further financial support for industries impacted by Section 232 tariffs. The source said the financial support will vary in size depending on the industry. Okay, so this is actually a really important piece of information, folks. So there's been a lot of speculation that Donald Trump would delay this tariff implementation, as has happened in other situations. So they're getting assurances that no, they're not going to delay this. Now, you can trust that that is not a bluff, or you can trust that that is a bluff. Doesn't matter. Can you afford that it's not a bluff? That's the question that the Canadian negotiators have to tangle with. And that's something that I hope Mark Carney himself is actually paying attention to. Now, just to recall, the financial support that they offered these industries that were impacted by the 232 tariffs amounted to a loan that they have to pay the interest back later. Here's the situation that they're in. So these companies make about 10% or less margins on their products right now. And these tariffs are in the range, specifically in the mold, tool, and die industry, of 15%. So if you're having to pay a tariff of 15% on the value of the whole product that's actually going over the border, and you only make 10% or less, you're selling that now at a loss. And if the government says, well, we'll cover the cost of those tariffs as a loan, you just have to pay us back interest later. Well, now that company is borrowing against the tariffs that they already can't pay because they don't have enough money. And then they're going to have to pay interest on top of that later on. So they can do business now, but they're perpetually going to go into more and more and more debt to the federal government just for doing business because Mark Carney can't do his job. And the government wants to profit off of that by having these businesses pay interest to them for not doing their job. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Canada that we're operating in right now. In the last 3 weeks, Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charest have met with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer 4 times over the last several weeks, sparking hope that the Americans were genuinely interested in striking a new trade deal. But their tone was far from optimistic on a series of briefing calls Friday with provincial premiers and the federal government's Advisory Committee on Canada-U.S. Economic Relations, 2 sources said. Remember that committee that was supposed to save the day? Yeah, I guess they're not. Despite the slow progress, discussions are quote-unquote sustained and comprehensive, one senior source told National Post John Iveson. On Friday morning, Greer said the U.S. will not tolerate retaliation from Canada, but is hopeful Canadians may take a more conciliatory approach. So I have a problem with that wording from Jamieson Greer because they don't want to tolerate retaliatory tariffs, but they're allowed to put punitive tariffs on Canada. Not really that fair, is it? And it doesn't surprise me if a lot of American or Canadians would be looking at that statement and saying, well, hold on here. What do you mean? You're putting tariffs on us and you don't want to tolerate when people put tariffs on them? So rules for thee, but not for me. Sounds like the Liberal government in Canada, doesn't it, folks? But again, this goes back to Mark Carney promising Canadians he would handle Donald Trump. And let's just look what's happened here. So Mark Carney, between the election and July, when he first promised a deal, couldn't get anything done. Then he promised it a couple weeks later, couldn't get anything done, started dropping tariffs, started making concessions to the United States, couldn't get anything done. A framework of a deal, we are told, was actually in place leading up to October, couldn't get anything done. It's reported that the Canadians walked away. It's reported that the Americans walked away. Who knows? A deal didn't get done. Then he famously told everybody that he didn't care about calling Donald Trump. Meanwhile, Canadians are losing their jobs. Businesses are leaving Canada and businesses are losing money. And then, because he couldn't get anything done, he convenes this special finance committee. So he appoints a bunch of other people to do the job for him. And then he sends down Dominic LeBlanc and Charest in order to do the negotiating. So what exactly are you doing, Mr. Carney? Canadians elected you to get this job done with Donald Trump, but you really haven't done anything. And you haven't gotten any results. All you've done is continue to capitulate. And this is what people are concerned about. This is why people are asking the question, well, what is Mark Carney actually doing? And we're just waiting for the Liberals to say, well, nobody can deal with Donald Trump. Well, hold on now. You don't get to walk that back. Absolutely not. After you've been promising for months that you were the guy to do it and that you were the guy to actually get a deal done. You don't get to walk that back. Sorry, sir. As Justin Trudeau said, you want to sit in the big chair? You got to take accountability. Well, that was the most important promise you actually made during the election. So if you start saying that, Canadians aren't going to buy it. Now we go to another publication because people will point at National Post if they don't like them or if they're partisan and say, well, that's National Post. That's a conservative paper. Fine. Here's a different one. So ladies and gentlemen, this is from Reuters. Canadian minister says Canada, US far apart on draft trade deal, source says. Canada and the US are still far from reaching a draft deal despite regular meetings. Dominic LeBlanc, the Canadian minister responsible for trade with the US, told an advisory committee on Friday, according to a source directly briefed on the matter. So this is coming directly from Dominic LeBlanc. LeBlanc is in Washington with his chief trade negotiator and a team of officials for discussions as the August 19th deadline approaches. That's 4 days away as of recording this video, for the start of the U.S. President Donald Trump's new 50% tariffs. LeBlanc has stepped up his engagement with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, meeting him 4 times in 3 weeks. LeBlanc's office said he will be staying in Washington for the weekend as trade talks continue. I hope so. Why is Mark Carney in Italy while you're in Washington? Canadians would like to know. The tariffs would cover nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods, or about 5.2% of Canada's exports to the United States. Unlike many of Trump's earlier tariffs, the new duties would apply to products that qualify for preferential treatment under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or CUSMA, or USMCA, however you want to phrase it, posing an additional risk to Canada's economy. LeBlanc said in a briefing to the Advisory Committee on Canada-U.S. Economic Relations that meetings are happening with his U.S. counterparts on a daily basis, the source said. Quote, "They said they're quite far away from an agreement that the Prime Minister can sign off on," end quote, the source said. Quote, "In negotiations like this, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed," end quote. The source added that LeBlanc told the committee the two sides are meeting at a technical level constantly but have not yet reached agreement on key issues. That's a big problem, folks. Gabriel Burnett, a spokesperson for LeBlanc, declined to comment. Now we're going to iPolitics, folks. No major breakthrough in Canada-US trade talks. Source: Canada and the US haven't made a major breakthrough yet despite intensive trade negotiations over the past week, according to a Canadian source familiar with the talks. The source said there remain several sticking points and dissatisfaction with where some of the proposed terms currently stand, including over potential Canadian concessions on dairy. Quote, "I don't think we're ready to give them what they want on dairy, and those are the kinds of things that you can imagine would be standing in the way," end quote, said the source, who asked not to be identified because they're not authorized to speak publicly. The federal government briefed the provinces and territories and members Carney's The federal government briefed the provinces and territories and members of Carney's Advisory Council on Canada-US Relations on Friday. Candace Lang, the president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and a member of the council, said she was told no extension was being discussed, though the Canadian team would stay in Washington over the weekend. She told iPolitics on Friday that things remain, quote-unquote, very fluid, and the focus remains on reaching an interim agreement to stave off the next wave of tariffs and addresses both sides' trade irritants. Once that happens, Canada and the U.S. can turn to negotiating a new trade pact and broader issues like critical minerals, Lang said. Quote, "Our trade relationship is like a patient in the ER, and job number one is to stabilize our patient. If the tariffs go into effect, we're heading into the intensive care unit," end quote. So this is 3 different publications. One is National Post, second is Reuters, and the third is iPolitics. Just to take that last analogy a little bit further, the problem is that a lot of Canadian businesses are already in the ICU, and some may be ready to head to palliative care. This is where we're at. And this is what makes this all the more frustrating. Because while this is going on, while there's a provincial-wide state of emergency in British Columbia with all of the forest fires, Mark Carney isn't even in the country. You might be able to forgive him a bit if he was on vacation at Harrington Lake, which is the official residence of the Prime Minister, sort of like the President of the United States, Camp David, because at least he's in the country, and he's in a government facility. But he's not. He's in Italy. And this doesn't make any sense. This shows a prime minister that doesn't take his job seriously. This shows a prime minister that doesn't really care about what is happening inside his own country. Doesn't really care how this lack of progress on this trade discussion that's been happening for over a year and a half now is actually having on Canadians, Canadian businesses, and their future. This shows a prime minister that has essentially abdicated his responsibilities to other people. Now, in the article, it talked about the fact that they're not really even coming to an agreement on key issues. This is really important because how these agreements typically go, because I've been involved in discussions and negotiations in the past, not to this scale, obviously, but there are very key issues that are important to both sides. And there's a lot of minor issues, and the minor issues usually outnumber the key issues, if you're lucky. So if you can come to an agreement on even some of those key issues, now you're starting to find common ground. And the more common ground you find, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes what that does is it allows momentum to pick up, and it makes both sides a little bit more agreeable in terms of finding common ground on other key issues that you may not have been able to get to before had you not come to an agreement on these other issues. So if one of these issues is American access to the dairy market, this sounds like an issue that if they're able to come to an agreement, whatever that is, that might actually make it easier to come to an agreement on the rest of the things. Here's the other concern I have based on what this article is talking about and the other articles. The big problem with Mr. Carney is right now he's been giving things up to get very little. And the concern that's out there is that now that he has been backed into a corner by Donald Trump, and we've been reporting on this since this new set of trade tariffs has been threatened, he's now in a position where he can't get a comprehensive deal. So now I don't think he's going to be able to get the premiers to come to an agreement on putting alcohol back on the shelves because now they are in emergency mode just to stop the tariffs from happening. So they're on the back foot because they're now not talking about CUSMA or USMCA. Now that's not even in the picture. Now they're over here. They're talking about how do we stop these trade tariffs. And what that does is it puts him in this position where you now have to make concessions just to stop those tariffs. And what else are you going to have left in the kitty when you're looking at this comprehensive USMCA? That's my concern. And that's the concern of a lot of actual economists across this country, economists we've spoken to on Northern Perspective like Catherine Swift, because if you've demonstrated to the other side that you're negotiating with that you will fold quickly and you will fold in large numbers, then they start to be able to count on that, and they expect that, which makes it harder and more difficult to negotiate with them in the future because they know that you folded in the past repeatedly. If he didn't fold and if he didn't give, an inch on a bunch of these things, then the expectation from Trump's team is going to be very different. We already know what to expect from Trump's team. They're going to take a firm position because they're in the position of strength. Unfortunately, they have the larger economy. But we haven't been showing strength this whole time. And that's been the problem. So they keep on picking away at us because Mr. Carney keeps on showing weakness. And the only thing I can think of why Mr. Carney is in Italy is to try to portray this mentality of, this doesn't bother me that much. I'm not in panic mode when it comes to this. But when you campaigned as the guy who could deal with Donald Trump and you campaigned on the guy that was returning to Canada in a time of crisis, that's how he marketed it. And he called this crisis the biggest crisis of our lifetimes. Why are you missing in action? Imagine if Winston Churchill, after being made prime minister during World War II, after telling all of the English and British people that we will fight them on the land, we will fight them in the air, we will fight them on the sea, and we will never surrender. Imagine what we would think of Winston Churchill if he then took a vacation and went to California. Ladies and gentlemen, This is the crisis that Mark Carney framed during the election. This is the expectation that he set Canadians. We have our own issues with Donald Trump and the fact that he is levying these tariffs in the first place. That's over here. But we're talking about Mark Carney and the expectation that he set for Canadians, and he absolutely is not living up to them. And Canadians are asking, where the hell are you?